I am Vilas Salunke. I am a professor of English. I have been teaching English for the last 50 years. Recently I have translated my third book of translations of g.a.Kulkarni's short stories from Marathi. The book is titled A Different Drummer, and it is published by Popular Prakashan, Mumbai. I am here to talk to you about one of the most important weaknesses that we as Indians have been feeling, namely translating Marathi works or regional works into English. We are always ready to translate from English into Marathi. I stay in Pune these days. If Pune has about 1,000 translators, there are hardly 10 or 15 who translate from Marathi into English. When I retired 20 years ago, I realized that a person who is good in English and a person whose roots are in the Marathi soil should try to translate some of the modern works of Marathi literature into English. There have been translations, but translations of the ancient tradition of Marathi authors. For example, people are willing to translate Jnaneshwar or Tuka. I am sure you must have heard the name of the book, Says Tuka. Of course, Tukaram and Jnaneshwar need to reach the English readership. But do we not have good authors who could be translated into English so that they could claim an important place in what we call world literature? I am sure you know that the only translation, Indian translation into English that fetched the Nobel Prize for Literature was done how many years ago? In 1913, nearly 90 years ago. And despite Rabindranath Tagore's translation of the Gitanjali, there have been no works which have reached that level. Today, when I decided to translate important authors from Marathi into English, I found that there are many authors who are not aware that they should be translated into a world language like English. There is an apathy, negligence on the part of authors. I have not received much encouragement from authors. And one of the important difficulties of translating into English is that you do not find publishers to translate Marathi literature into English. And without authors' support, it is very difficult. But I tried to face all those difficulties, and during the last 20 years, I retired in 2001. And now in about 21 years or so, I have translated about 15-16 books into English. Of course, they are of variety of qualities. The best, of course, is g.a.Kulkarni. I have now completed translations of 32 short stories of G.A. The earlier two books that I published, the first was A Journey Forever, which had 13 short stories, and the major story that I translated was Iskilar, which runs into about 90 pages. The second book I translated was Shadows in the Desert, a book which has 14 short stories, and the first major story in that collection is Vidushaka. Now these are immortal stories. I claim that they are great stories which can be studied, analyzed by English readership all over the world. But without translation, we will not be able to make any claim for that. Let me come to the basic desire that I had. I repeat, I claim that G.a. Kulkarni has made a substantial contribution to the literary form of the short story at world literature level. This is a tall claim, I know it. But I feel that this man is compared with someone like Franz Kafka or someone like Jorge Borges, the author from Argentina. Both are short story writers. G.a. never tried to write a novel, and what he achieved, he brought the depth and the scope of the novel form to the short story form. Everybody knows that G.a. started writing regional stories, realistic stories of people who lived on the boundary of Maharashtra and Karnataka. And all those stories were so realistic that he was able to go beyond the regional and ascertain a claim that he could say something about human life, human nature in the social, cultural context of the people of this region. This claim of his regional short stories continued for about 4 books, the first 4 books that he wrote. And there are scholars who still believe that G.a.'s regional realistic stories are great contributions by G.a. But whatever I have read, I am not a voracious reader of Marathi literature. I belong to Marathi, my mother tongue is Marathi, but I am a student of English literature. The amount of English literature I have read, I have not read that much from Marathi. But after my retirement, I thought that my Marathi background could be used to take some important authors into English. So after completing 27 short stories, today I have come to the 3rd book, which Shri Ramdas Bhatkal of Popular Prakashan has brought it to the publication level. The book is called A Different Drummer. The title is taken from a quote that G.a. Kulkarni used for his Sahitya Akademi Award winning collection, Kajalmaya. The collection refers to G.a. as a person who does not get along with his companions because probably he has heard a different drummer. This image, G.a. is very famous for his images and symbols. This image that G.a. heard a different drummer, and whatever he heard, he turned those sounds into a verbal form, gave a verbal form to the sounds that he heard. I don't know whether he heard or whether he seemed to hear. There is a very famous quotation of John Keats. Keats says, "Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter still." G.A. was a person who was able to hear as well as not hear from our point of view, but from his point of view, he heard and turned that into a verbal form. According to me, G.A. is one of the greatest authors of the English of the Marathi language, because he would not allow his readers to make a change, not with regard to words, with regard to phrases, with regard to sentences, with regard to images and symbols that he uses. You have to be very particular when you translate G.A. because you have to hold his finger and get along with him. I told you, I have been a reader of G.A. for the last 20 years. In fact, my association with G.A. goes back to 1987. Just 2 months before G.A. died in Pune, I had made up my mind to translate one of his stories for a British Council short story competition. The story was called Sarpa, and I translated it and sent it to Popular Prakashan. I was at Nasik, of course I didn't know the publisher. The story went to, again, Ramdas Bhatkar. He sent it to G.A. G.A. was in Pune, and G.A. wrote me a letter, a 2-page letter. I still preserve it. He said, "People have asked me this question. Why didn't you translate your own stories into English?" He was a professor of English. "If I were to translate my stories into English," he wrote in that letter, "I would have probably used some different phrases or different words. And I have suggested some of them in the letter, but they are necessarily not better than yours. I think a translator like you has the same amount of freedom that I would have if I were to translate my stories into English." And that sentence gave me a support to translate G.A. because the translation studies has been a very well-known branch of knowledge, but hardly any theory helps when you come to literary translation. You have to take on-the-spot decisions with regard to all the aspects of English. And you reach a stage with regard to G.A. when you face the question, do I translate or not translate? There is an amount of untranslatability involved in some of the texts. After completing 32 stories, I want to complete one more story and one more collection of stories, adding about 10-15 tales to it. I don't know whether I will be able to achieve it. If I get a publisher, I will certainly do it. But I have certain stories calling me even now. Tuti is a story which I have not dared to touch even now. Or a story like Vees. It's such a complex and difficult story that one should first bow down before it and keep quiet. I have kept quiet. But whatever I have done tells me that the single contribution that G.A. has made is to the technique called magic realism. I am sure students of literature know that all over the world, most important authors of the last 100 years, have used this technique called magic realism. G.A. has contributed to it by writing short stories, not novels. Most of the authors who have handled magic realism superbly have written novels. G.A. did it in the short story form. How did he do it? He combined his realistic regional stories and added magic realism to it. Realism was already there, he added a magical aspect to it by using fantasy on the basis of imagination. Some of the Marathi critics have called it Drishtanta Katha. I am not very happy with the term Drishtanta Katha, though there is an element of revelation, but I would rather prefer the word used by an English author who called it epiphany. G.A., the present book is called Different Drummer. G.A. picked up something mysteriously and turned it into a verbal form. He probably was not even conscious of what he was doing, because the final form that he gives to the story is so, superb. It is unmatched. I will give you an example. A story like Iskilar, which runs into 90 pages, you have to read, reread 2, 3, 4, 5 times. You require discerning readers to take up the challenge of G.A. Now, why do you have to take up a challenge to read an author? It is because G.A. was, as a professor of English, aware of the nature of language which some critics have pointed out. I am referring to a man like Jacques Derrida, who said that language is a free play, and he believed that language is not an adequate means of communication, because language only gives you what he called trace, and therefore when, particularly in the written form, not in the oral, because when we speak we think our listeners understand us, but when you come to writing, how much do we understand? We understand only part of any text written in any language. Jacques Derrida was a philosopher of language. He said, we understand part of the written language and the remaining we postpone, defer. Even, I have been teaching this and I have been telling my students, even the lead article of the Times of India, when you read, you understand part of it. Not to talk about fiction, not to talk about poetry. There is a very well-known sentence about poetry. Poetry should not mean, but be. What does it say? G.A.'s short stories exist on the printed page, and G.A. did not comment on his stories. He did not discuss them. He did not want people to reach him as an individual. There are all sorts of stories. His photograph was not available. He used to lock his door and used to sit inside and write. He avoided functions. He was not a public figure in any way because he wanted people to remain alive only through the written words. Now coming to the book being published now, The Different Drummer. There are, as a translator, I have chosen both types of stories. I claim that his so-called Drishtanta Katha has made a substantial contribution. But I do not want to set aside the regional realistic tales that he wrote earlier. Therefore, a story like Kankane, which I have translated as The Sound of Bangles, it's a masterpiece. From any standard, it's a masterpiece. We hesitate calling our literature using words like masterpiece. Similarly, there is a story like Pravas, which I have translated as Life is a Journey. It's a masterpiece. Only an author like G.a. could write such a tale. There are regional, realistic stories as well as metaphorical, symbolic and allegorical stories. The second type is easy, comparatively easy for readership all over the world to follow G.a. because the cultural references in his realistic tales are very difficult to express well in English. A great problem with translation is that people want to use footnotes. I will give an example. A novel like Khosla translated into English has 150 footnotes. Now Khosla is a great novel because it's a readable novel. Now if a readable novel is translated and you have to go to the last page and look up references and come back to the original, the readability is lost. That is not what a translation is supposed to do. In all the 3 books that I have translated for G.a., there is not a single footnote. The problems of cultural transference are put into the text itself. For example, a word like Mangal Sutra. In the text itself you say that the woman seemed to be married because she had a gold ornament around her neck. That is enough. Instead of giving 10 lines below explaining what Mangal Sutra is. Therefore, this book will reach not only non-Marathi readers from India, but also readers all over the world. And I want people to meet a man like G.a. who is Franz Kafka of India. And if I am able to do that, at least to some extent, I will consider myself very lucky and my life will be fulfilled. Thank you.